Hello my dear Odooers, welcome back to my channel. In today's tutorial, I will discuss all you need to know about QWEB, which is the templating engine of Odoo. I will be covering from basic to advanced functionalities on how to implement QWEB templates both from Python and JavaScript code. At the end of this tutorial, we will complete all these functionalities including basics, attributes, templates, etc. In the last part, I will be showing you how you can implement QWEB using JavaScript from the front end using public widgets and old framework. Alright guys, if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe for more tutorials like this. Without much further ado, let's get started. Before we start coding, let's have a quick overview of QWEB. QWEB is based on XML, which will generate HTML elements to be used in creating web pages and PDF reports. Using QWEB, it is easier to add dynamic content instead of static content like using pure HTML. Odoo uses QWEB both for Python and JavaScript code, and with that, there are several ways to import it. If you want to use it in Python, create it by defining a new template with Odoo as the root element by providing ID and name attributes. This file should be added under the data property, which will then be saved automatically in ir.ui.view model, having type as QM, which can then be used in PDF reports, website pages, and as HTML fragments for subtemplates. This template can then interpret Python expressions like datetime or any values from the controller. Then for JavaScript, QWEB can be created using templates as the root element by providing telement and tname attribute. This file cannot be added to data but under the assets property. This template then will not be stored in the database and will be loaded only when needed using tcall_assets directive. You can see that under the Network tab, JS files, and for example, web.assets frontend lazy.js. You can search for your module here as well as any template you created. These templates are usually used in web client for all components, website editor, public widgets, and website snippets. This template can then interpret JavaScript expressions or any props added by all components or widgets. So these are the ways to import and use QWEB in both Python and JavaScript. But don't be confused since the implementation is very similar. Let's first implement it using Python code in rendering web pages using the normal MVC pattern. By the way, in this tutorial, I am using the latest version of Odoo, which is 17. So if you want to use it, make sure to update Python 3.10 and the installation will be the same. While doing some testing, I found some changes in the code, like setting attributes, for example, are already removed. Maybe more to that in my next tutorials for Odoo 17. As you can see, I have already created a simple module with the basic template and a controller. And if you check on the browser, it's displaying the elements I added. Now let's start building a web page by adding HTML, head, and body. If you want to make it simple, just add any external CSS and JS libraries as you do in a normal HTML file. In this case, I will add the Bootstrap CSS framework, then design it using Bootstrap classes. Before we check, let's add dev XML to the PyCharm configuration so that we don't need to upgrade the module every time we make changes. Let's then go back and reload. Now this is better. But since Odoo already has Bootstrap installed, we can just call the first QWEB directive I will teach you, which is tcall_assets, and it will download all assets needed only for the front end, or any custom assets you want. This is nice if you're building a simple page, or maybe a single page application using all. More to that later, let's not complicate it at this point. Having said that, why don't we just use the default Odoo layout by calling website.layoutTemplate. Then I will pass all of these elements as children of this template. Then in the controller, we just need to add website is equal to true. Let's restart and reload the page. And there you go. A header and a footer were automatically added. Okay, let me just copy some code in Bootstrap for our easy navigation and tabs. Let's remove other codes. Then for our first topic will be data output. Let's rename these to basics. And then we also need a table with Bootstrap classes. Go back to the browser, reload, and yes, it's working fine. For data output, there are several data types you can render, and it's being done using T prefix followed by either out or ESC. Both of these are the same, which automatically escapes the data for security. Let's start by rendering different data types like string, integer, float, list, list item, dictionary, and dictionary item. Whichever elements thetout attribute has been added, the data will be automatically rendered as a children element, and in this case, under span element. You can directly pass them in the template itself or pass them under the controller. Let's create a new dictionary by passing several data types for string, integer, float, boolean, list, and dictionary, and passing it under the render method as a second parameter. Restart Odoo, add the variables added in our template for string, integer, float, list, list key, dictionary, and dictionary item. Go back and reload, and there you go. All these data types have been successfully added. Not only that, we are also able to render a function and Python objects like datetime, a model, and a model field. Under the controller, let's define a new function that will return a simple string. And any model using http.request.env, let's try the sale order model with the search method to get all the records. Restart the server and add these variables in the template. For Python objects, just add datetime.datetime and use the now method. For the model and model field name, go back and reload, and yes, we got the correct values. One directive you can use when dealing with model is the T field, which makes it automatically editable when the website editor is activated. Using T field, you can also add options to add some formatting like datetime widget and show date only. Now let's move on to setting variables, which can be done using the tset directive. Setting a variable has many ways in setting its values. Let's do it first by setting a new variable, string value, and use tvalue directive to set the value. In this case, let's just simply add a string by adding a single quotation. Otherwise, it will be interpreted as a variable. We can also add value as string literals using tvaluef. Using tvaluef directive, this means any string we added will not be interpreted as an expression, and then we can append any variables by adding double curly brackets, and inside that, you can add any variables either coming from the template or the controller. It's also possible to add Python expressions like a simple add operation, then a Python object like datetime, or any values coming from the controller like the model. It's possible to set HTML values by adding them as a child element of the variable. Let's then render these variables using tout. Go back and reload. Alright, we got the correct results, even the HTML values. Let's move to conditional, and here we only have three directives, which are TIF for the initial condition, TLIF for other conditions, and TELSE for the fallback condition. Well, you are already familiar with this, but let's just try using it by checking if the user is currently logged in using request.session.uid. Then for multiple condition, let's print public user if the user ID.login is public or admin portal, else just print other user. Go back and reload. Okay, right now, I'm an admin user. Let's try the public user. But before that, let's add sudo method in sale order before search method to avoid permission error for the public user. Go back and open private mode. And yes, we are getting a public user. Next, let's do the looping. And here, we need t for each directive and t as to assign the values of each item on the list. Let's try first assigning static list and assign it to a variable number and set t out in rendering each number. We can also use Python methods like range and this will do the same thing. Let's go back and reload. As you can see, we have the same result, except that the range method starts with 0. Going back to our code, there are additional methods we can use inside t for each, like index, which will print the current index of each number. So to fix the index which starts with 0, we can add +1. We can also use first directive which will check the first element easily, as well as with the last element. It's also possible to check whether the current index is even or odd. Lastly, we can get the total list size using the size directive. Let's set a new variable list length with initial value to 0, and inside the loop, assign list length with a value to number underscore size. Then render the output below the list. Let's add some classes. Go back and reload. And there you go. We have successfully used several methods under t for each method. Lastly, we can also assign model in t for each and easily render the field name as well. Now let's move on to setting attributes. So for setting attributes, we will be using t@at directive for an expression, tattf for string literals. Let's do first using an expression. Say for example, you want to render the user's website, and with that, we need an anchor element to make the link dynamic. We need to use t@at directive followed by the attribute we want, which is href, and pass the current user ID, partner ID, website. Then inside this element, let's render the website using tout. In case you want to modify the href attribute, like for example, an email, we need to pass mail to string first. We can do that by using the same method, except that we need to pass a string mail to and format it using %s to concatenate the user email address. But sometimes, it's easier to do it the other way around, like just passing the string and injecting any Python expressions. We can do that using tattf directive. In this method, we can inject expressions using double curly brackets or single curly brackets, but with a hash at the start of the bracket. Using this method, we can also add conditional logic, which is nice when assigning classes to specific elements. We can also assign multiple attributes at once by passing an object. For example, in rendering the website, to make it more SEO friendly, we also need to add a title. By passing an object, this will automatically render both the href and title attributes. Lastly, you can also use the pairing method, like passing a list with 2 items. I don't usually use this, but let's try to use it in the checkbox element, wherein we can add some condition inside the parentheses. Say we will only render the check attribute if there's a currently logged in user. Otherwise, add an empty string. On the next list item, add a string check. This means this check attribute value will always be printed but will have an empty attribute name if there's no login user, thus will not work. Go back and reload. Alright, let's try the public user, and yes, the attributes are all working fine. Now let's move on to sub-templates. So here, we need to add tcall directive and the value will be the name of the template. This is beneficial since we can break down the user interface into sub-templates which can be used many times. Let's first create a static template wherein we will not pass any dynamic value inside the template. When defining a template, you don't have to worry about the same name with other modules since when saved in the database, it will automatically add the name of the module. In this case, when calling this template, you need to add first the name of the module, followed by period, and then the name of the template. Go back, upgrade the module, and reload the page. Okay, it's working fine. Next, let's do the dynamic template. And a good example is a list of blog posts. Let's create an article with some classes. For the title, you want to make it dynamic, so let's usetout attribute by passing a variable named article title. Now, before calling this template, we need first to pass a value to article title, and in this case, it's a global variable. Now we can call the dynamic template since there's already a value needed in this template. Go back and reload. Okay, we successfully added a dynamic value to the template. Aside from the global variable, we can also use a scope variable by setting the article value inside the template like this so that you don't have to worry about variable name issues. Whatever you set here will not be available outside this template. We can also pass any children elements as you want, either calling again other subtemplates. Then when rendering children elements, we still need to usetout, but the value must be 0. This will automatically render any children elements. Go back and check. Okay, it's working fine. Using this method, we can mimic the slots method in all. Instead of adding any elements, we can just use Tout Directive and leaving Tout 0 for any default children elements. Now when calling this template, you can use tset and add any children element, and now the position doesn't matter even if the body comes first or not. But still, you can add any default children elements. Go back, upgrade the module, then reload. Alright. But let's fix this. This should be only T since we are passing an HTML elements already. Go back and reload. Okay. Next, let's do the security. The first option that you can use here if you want to hide some elements from other users is using tgroups directive. Say for example, if we want this element to show only to admin users, we need to use tgroups and add a group external ID reference. Then add any elements for public users. Go back, reload the page, and yes, my user is admin so I can see this element. Let's try the public user. Okay, it's working fine. The other security issue is when you want to render user-defined inputs like the online chat for example. Well, first of all, it's not possible to use tout in rendering HTML elements because it will throw an error. But of course, this will mostly come from the database or the controller. So let's try to add a new property HTML and pass a string with HTML elements. Restart Odoo and render these to the template. Go back and reload. As you can see, tout will automatically escape the HTML elements and thus will be rendered as a text instead of HTML. You can, however, use the trow directive so that it will not be escaped and just render whatever you added. This, however, has security issues. When an attacker adds a script tag and just to test, let's add a simple alert method. Restart Odoo, go back, and reload the page. The script worked. So to fix this, you need to escape first any user input by importing HTML escape from odoo.tools. Then use the format string and use HTML escape method for any user inputs, leaving any HTML elements you want to render. Restart Odoo, go back and reload, and now the script did not run and was escaped. You can also use HTML sanitize method, which will automatically remove unsafe HTML elements. This method is fine, but you may forget to sanitize it. In that case, they made this method deprecated, as you can see on the logs as a warning. You then need to use markup method from markup safe. Odoo prefers this method since it has a built-in escape method when formatting the string without using HTML escape. Let's start Odoo, then under the template, render it using the Tout directive. Go back and reload, and as you can see, we just achieved the same thing. To check if it's actually escaped, just add str method inside this variable. Go back, and there you go. And that's it guys for this episode. For the next topic, we are going to discuss cache method, template inheritance, and including QWEB using JavaScript code. We will be rendering templates using the website public widget and all framework. Thank you guys and see you next time.